So I think I want to read some things that I was writing yesterday in a dessert bar here in Melbourne, which I go to recently because they're open quite late and they do coffee, and I'm not really much of a drinker of alcohol except in my own, house or whatever, just because it's so expensive here. Um, I wanted to also update on kind of the last kind of 3 albums at the end of the year that I'm writing, because I think that they are the last sort of Desi albums. But before that, I wanted to read this thing that I wrote, as I say, about art and authenticity and life, and I don't know, this idea of nuance also is as well. So I shall just read it. I think it should be easier. Um, yeah, to be human is to be tender, I realised. I think the only place I can truly be authentic is in my art, my work. In life, people, etc., you or I always have the persona of some kind, usually a politeness and a self-awareness that is unfortunately though exhausting. To be honest and intuitive in public with others, you pay a heavy price because society, nay civilization, is a game of lies, adjustments, and compromises. It is an invention of fabricated material, but also emotional scarcity. If you find yourself authentic, you will soon find yourself a fringe dweller, considered mad or naive. It isn't a lack of capacity, but of context, which leads so few to live authentically, which I thought was quite a revelation, actually, that it's the capacity. It's not the lack of capacity, rather, but the contextualizations of society, of people, that mean that a lot of us, most people, actually can't live authentically. Hence, to exist within both society and self, one has to be honest as possible in self and self-expression, yet also tightrope the thin line of tolerated and accepted, to be flamboyantly yourself and aggressive about it, without compromise, that means, equals a certain social or literal fatalistic quality reaction. I think to be yourself under a mask of effortless conformity, so be bifabricated, as we all intrinsically are anyway, but just make it more adamant. A private self, the so-called true self, which I say would be like, thinking of it like portraits, this would be the warts and all portrait, your private self. With the public, conform to comfort is one of my ways of saying this. Conform to comfort or soothe, and perhaps further, a curated self, the dream self, simulacra, the perfect portrait. If you go to a portrait gallery in your local museum, you'll see what I mean. There's kind of the more private ones, where they're actually dressed in a dressing gown or something, or robes, or that's very, like, you can see all the spots on their faces and it's not airbrushed, let's say. And then you have a portrait which is sort of like this very beautiful one, like domestic, but it's domestic sort of public-private sort of thing, or it's in the street or something like this. And then of course you have the dream portraits. Usually these of course are the kings and queens or the high nobility or whatever, things like that. The super rich have these very airbrushed, almost magisterial portraits. And I think actually we ourselves are very similar individuals within postmodernity, within the society, the OECD anyway. So perhaps instead of treating all of these seriously, it is better to treat them with the lightness of a feather, to allow them to be endlessly metamorphosizing and intrinsically, almost psychedelically experimental. The self is psychodynamically a collection of echoes and voices, introjects, judgments, opinions and perceptions from the external world. Everyone's self is therefore reactive, sure, like an immune system. That is how to construct one, in opposition or integration into something, i.e. society, disease, etc. It would seem, therefore, a lot of mental illness stems from a salient concept of usually public self, which is physically articulated and physically observed by others. And the dissonance that creates mentally, i.e., life is almost entirely physical, that a lot of our terrors and issues are actually psychologically. Openness, vulnerability being one of these core aspects of that, the fear to be vulnerable. Consistence of values becomes a style, which I put emphasis or precedence to, not the aesthetical necessarily, but the fundamental. No matter the costume changes, the heart remains the same. Further, life is not a vicious struggle, but a quiet acceptance. Nothing ultimately changes, and if it changes, in brackets, this is just the illusion of aesthetics, because the human condition is eternal. It outlived and will outlive all experiments and exercises in civilization. Acts of progressive tolerance are nothing more substantial or long-lasting than fireflies at night, or the odd spark of a raging fire. Experiments in perceptive excellence, you could say. History is linear in many ways, but social in... I will begin that again. Experiments in perceptive social excellence is what I meant in terms of relation to this idea of progressive tolerance. Further, history is linear in many ways, but in many more it is cyclical. So to take all of this online, offline sound and fury as what it is, instead of what you think it is, which is, it actually is simply a vortex of hot air. It's like the Shakespeare quote, sound and fury signifying nothing. To be seen as different isn't hard. To remain different is exceptionally difficult. So to articulate yourself as, in clothes, whatever, to begin with, when you're young or whatever, it's not so difficult, it's not so hard to do that, especially in this commodification that we live in, and these nuances of capitalism in the late second half of the 20th century, and presumably so far the first half of the 21st. But what's harder is consistency of that. Finding a look, finding a subculture, finding yourself, right? And sticking to it, that's exceptionally difficult, because you're going to always be in some form of reactive opposition to you. Every revolution has a counter-revolution, right? Even small self-fundamental ones, of you or me. And I think one has to sort of go through life with that somewhere in your head. In a sense, you're almost like a warrior. But I prefer to think of it like a cavalier than a warrior. It's more sophisticated, I think. The self-comfortable person's drugs of choice are oxygen and water, not weed and alcohol. I thought I would say that to you. I mean, you have to be sober and alert constantly to be yourself, truly. You can't be anesthetized or in a form of dissonance through any form of narcotics, even psychedelics, because I think that then you actually lose yourself. The ability of that consistency it boils away or evaporates in the sort of narcotic haze of imbibing into those sorts of drugs. It's like Dali says, right? I'm not on drugs. I am drugs. It's like that. I can't find a puddle of resentment and despondency deep enough to drown myself in. Unlike most of my generation, people who are secure in themselves don't drink neither caffeine nor alcohol, or smoke or swallow narcotics, in an attempt to blot out the less than salubrious aspects of reality. Surely, logically, wouldn't it be far easier to simply never conform in the first place, than imbibe in libations and feasts of strategic disassociation, in order to feel free? Our regimented identities, and this is where I come into something I thought was, it's something that I got from Fisher and obviously Marx, and a few others, by Frowen and others as well, Jameson. Our regimented identities are a direct result of industrialization and the resulting capitalist ordering of nature-reality. Our obsession with labeling and preemphasis on social, scientific, and economic delineations and demarcations infects the very thoughts. The bones of the self are thoughts, one could say. Hence, we conceptualize ourselves in a mosaic, of commodifiable attributes, sex, race, economic class, etc., rather than a landscape of integrated, seamless whole. This leaves us open to subtle emotional influences, marketing, insults, etc., because we both can never heal from the fractured existence we live in, the acid bath of hyper-consumerism and hyper-competition capitalist ideology, which many call late neoliberalism at this point, and can never mend our inner primordial self, which in many instances has has either been strangled or stillborn in us as young children, conform to ideology or face the terror of exile, which is stats for death, of course, in society. So I thought about Crispian philosophy, or Crisperanto, which is the philosophy of Quentin Crisp. But I also thought about Epicurus, and I also thought about dandyism. And then I follow a really great channel of this lady, Celine, and it's called Heaven Sent Honey, and she talks a lot about the aesthetical and the sensual, which are not mutually exclusive. Well, they are actually in many ways. They're not necessarily, but in many ways they are also. Because you have to focalize yourself onto like a pre-emphasis on sense perception. And also, therefore, beauty and aesthetics come into play. As you can see, I'm wearing gold, I'm wearing a ruby, I've got this, I've got my hair done, okay, I've got white shirts, and I've got fur, right? So there is an aesthetical element to it. It looks beautiful, relatively speaking, unless I was in a dirty top and dribbling up my mouth and not washed or anything else, right? So in juxtaposition to that, or in comparison to that, or opposition to that. And then I also have these sensual elements. This is a sensual thing to play with almost. My hair, of course, as well, is, it's nice to put your hand through your hair, no? Everyone does this. And also, similar feeling of the hair to the fur, you see? So in that sense, it's sensual. Sensual is the touch, the nice feeling of it, and aesthetical in that it looks pleasing, generally pleasing to the eye, to an observer. Even with the asymmetry of it, that this jangles, that this doesn't. There's not this balance, right? But there is still something attractive about it, you see. So it's the articulation of this, through the use of sensuality as well. So that's sort of something I wanted to say, because I think, in terms of what I've just talked about, I think what is the solution? I always am curious about solutions to philosophical or ideological issues. I mean, I think much actual philosophers, I'm not a philosopher, but actual philosophers are. I think the solution is also advocated by Celine, actually, and she condenses it down to three or four, actually, sorry, brackets, I guess you could say, which is bohemianism, dandyism, aestheticism, and asceticism. So, I think bohemianism is the creative self, the expression, and the voluntary simplicity that comes from that lifestyle choice, let's say. With dandyism, that is handmade, it's upcycled, not invested in the marketing outcomes of advertising and things like this. It's about rearticulating, usually thriftily, in an op shop or a thrift store in America, they're called, a way to use antique clothes or vintage clothes and rearticulate them, or just articulate them how they were articulated in the first place. And you put them together. It's a sort of pastiche which is intrinsic to the postmodern experience. Pastiche and postmodernism are pretty much almost the same in this sense. The use of aesthetics, which is again the beautification aspect, as a rebellion against the consumerist conformity masquerading as individuality that we live in, i.e. Instagram, just go and look. Everyone looks the same, although they're all posing to be different. It's a farce. But further also is aesthetics, a savouring of beautiful objects and clothes, experiences, and a devotion to sensuality, and finally the grace and discipline of a touch of aestheticism, which is essentially a sort of form of meditative control of the self. So I think these could be answers to aspects of what I just outlined. So yes, I don't know, what do you think? Leave a message or a comment. Let's start a dialogue. If anyone actually does watch this, that would be wonderful. And yes, thank you for watching. I hope this was interesting to anyone that did watch. Okay, ciao.